Story number 1.
The first snow of the season had fallen early that year. By the time the middle of December arrived, it had already piled up to knee-deep in most places in the northern woods. Adam had been looking forward to this trip for months. Every year he ventured into the wild to a small cabin his grandfather had built when he was a boy. It wasn't much, barely a one-room structure, but it had always been enough to get away from the pressures of everyday life. This year, though, felt different. Adam was no stranger to the deep woods of northern Michigan. He had spent countless winters hunting with his father and his grandfather. The bitter cold, the quiet serenity of the snow-covered trees, and the deep winter stillness were all familiar to him. But after his father passed away earlier that fall, the idea of hunting alone for the first time was unsettling. The first few days had been quiet. Adam spent his mornings gathering firewood and checking traps he had set around the property. In the afternoons, he ventured deeper into the forest to look for game. He had seen signs of deer, some tracks in the snow, but nothing had ventured close enough to make a shot. It wasn't until the fourth evening that things started to feel wrong. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest as Adam made his way back to the cabin after another fruitless day of hunting. The wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped quickly. The snow crunched under his boots with each step, the sound echoing unnervingly in the silent woods. He was exhausted and disappointed, but there was still a part of him that loved the solitude, the rhythm of the wilderness. When Adam reached the clearing, just before the cabin, he stopped dead in his tracks. A figure was standing by the edge of the trees, just at the tree line. The figure was tall, wrapped in a dark coat, but it wasn't moving. At first, Adam thought it was another hunter, someone who had wandered onto his property. But then he noticed that the figure seemed out of place. It wasn't holding a rifle, nor was there any other movement in the trees. The hair on the back of Adam's neck stood up. He called out, but the figure didn't respond. His voice echoed in the cold air, but there was no answer. He took a few cautious steps forward, still calling out, but the figure remained unmoving. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind whipped through the trees, causing the figure to shift. Adam froze. The wind had seemed to move right through the figure, as though it wasn't real. He squinted, trying to focus, but the figure was gone. Just like that, it had vanished without a trace. Adam's heart was racing now. He scanned the clearing, then the trees beyond. The hairs on his neck remained raised, and his breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. He had never been particularly superstitious, but he could feel a deep, uncomfortable presence in the air now. Shaking his head, Adam turned and walked briskly back to the cabin. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or his imagination playing tricks on him. But that didn't ease the tightness in his chest as he hurried inside, locking the door behind him. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's thin walls. Adam tried to ignore it, forcing himself to focus on the crackling fire. He hadn't even bothered to eat dinner. He simply sat there, staring into the flames, thinking about what he had seen. The figure. The way it had disappeared. It wasn't like anything he had ever encountered before. As the hours passed, the feeling of unease didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger. The fire had died down to embers, and Adam decided to head to bed. The cabin was small, with only one bedroom, and he had always found comfort in the simplicity of it. But tonight, sleep didn't come easy. Every small sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin. The creak of the wood settling, the whisper of the wind outside, the snap of a branch in the distance. But it was when the door creaked that Adam's eyes snapped open. At first, he thought it was the wind. But then, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps approaching the cabin door. His breath caught in his throat. The footsteps weren't like the normal sounds of wildlife in the woods. These steps were too measured, too purposeful. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The figure from earlier? Was it back? He grabbed his rifle from where it lay propped up against the wall, his fingers trembling. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside, and there was a long pause. The air seemed to grow heavier, like the world was holding its breath. Then the doorknob turned. Adam's blood ran cold as the door creaked open slowly, as if something or someone was trying to enter. His mind raced. Who could it be? There was no one else around, no other hunters. He didn't think he had heard any vehicles passing on the road, but still, someone or something was outside. With his rifle raised, he crept toward the door, careful not to make a sound. He reached for the handle and yanked it open with all his strength, stepping back quickly to aim his gun at the threshold. But there was no one there, just snow. For a long moment, Adam stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The snow on the doorstep was undisturbed, nothing out of place. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The only evidence that something had happened was the door itself, ajar, swaying slightly as if it had just been opened. What the hell? The wind had died down again, leaving the woods eerily silent. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever, and Adam's eyes darted around, searching for any movement. But the clearing was still, the forest unbroken. It was as though nothing had happened at all. Adam stepped back inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. He stood there for a long time, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself that it had just been the wind, that his mind had played tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it hadn't been the wind. The next day, Adam tried to go about his usual routine. He went out to check his traps, but the familiar rhythm of the woods did little to ease the sense of foreboding that hung over him. The whole day felt off. Every step he took in the snow seemed to echo too loudly, and the trees around him felt too still, too watchful. As the sun began to set, Adam returned to the cabin. He had decided to leave in the morning to head back into town away from the strange occurrences. But as he reached the cabin, he saw something that made his stomach turn. The tracks. Footprints, large, deep indentations in the snow, leading up to the front door. They were fresh, recent. But they weren't from any animal he recognized. The shape was all wrong, too wide, too unnatural. The steps stopped just before the door. Adam's heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He had to get out of there. Now. But before he could turn to leave, a voice called out, barely audible above the wind. Adam. He spun around, eyes wide, but saw no one. The voice had been distant, but unmistakable, a voice he knew all too well. "Dad?" Adam whispered, his voice trembling. He had heard it, the deep, gravelly voice of his father. But that was impossible. His father had been dead for months. "Adam!" The voice came again, louder this time, almost a whisper in the wind. Adam turned and ran. He didn't look back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
We had been planning our winter hunting trip for months, and the time had finally come. The four of us, me, my brother Andy, our cousin Mark, and our old friend Tyler, had been hunting in these woods for years. But this trip was different. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. It was early January, and the snow had already piled up deep in the Adirondacks. We rented a small, isolated cabin from a local who didn't speak much when we met him. But his eyes were always watching, like he knew more than he let on. We didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to the usual reclusiveness of people who live in the middle of nowhere. The plan was simple. Get out to the cabin, hunt for a few days, and then return home. A typical winter hunting trip for us. Nothing too extraordinary. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the snow-covered mountains. The cabin was small but sturdy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. A single light was on inside, flickering from the wood-burning stove. We unloaded our gear, made ourselves comfortable, and sat around the stove to warm up. It felt like a perfect night to relax. The wind was howling outside, pushing the snow against the windows, and the temperature had dropped sharply. After a long day of driving, we didn't feel like heading back out into the woods, so we cracked open some beers and started telling stories. Tyler, being the Joker, entertained us with tall tales of ghostly encounters, but none of us took him seriously. He had a way of making everything sound absurd. "It's all in your head," Andy said, sipping his beer. "If you go looking for ghosts in the woods, you'll find them, but that doesn't mean they're real." We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The wind outside seemed to carry strange noises, soft, creaking, faint scraping, like something was moving just outside the cabin. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the wind, but the longer I sat there, the more the noises seemed to come in patterns, like footsteps in the snow. It wasn't until later that night when we were preparing to go to bed that things took an unsettling turn. Tyler was the last to head to his room, and as he opened the door, we heard him stop mid-step. He looked back at us, his face pale. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. None of us had heard anything, at least not right then. But Tyler was convinced. He said he heard someone walking around the cabin. His description was detailed. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow like someone was circling the cabin just outside the walls. We all thought he was joking at first, but as the minutes passed, we couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. We listened intently. The wind had picked up, but under the gusts, we could hear the faintest sounds, footsteps, just outside, moving around the cabin. Mark, who wasn't one for superstitions, grabbed a flashlight and went out to investigate. We followed him reluctantly, unsure of what to expect, but too curious to stay behind. Mark shone the flashlight across the snow, scanning the area around the cabin, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of trees and the thick blanket of snow. No footprints, no sign of anyone. "See?" Mark said, turning to us with a grin. "Nothing." We all laughed nervously, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We headed back inside, locked the door, and tried to put it out of our minds. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping. It was soft at first, like someone knocking on the cabin door, but it was coming from the window. I slowly turned my head toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The window was covered in a thick layer of frost, and I couldn't see anything through the glass. The tapping continued, rhythmic, like someone was trying to get our attention. I lay frozen, not daring to move, wondering if I was imagining it. But then it stopped. I wanted to get up to go check the window, but the room felt so cold, so still. The silence was deafening. I lay there for what felt like hours before I heard another noise, this time a scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It was coming from the hallway. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I could hear the others breathing softly in their sleep, just unaware of the strange noises that seemed to fill the cabin. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my body trembling. I opened the door just a crack and listened. The scraping noise was faint but persistent. It was coming from the kitchen, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I stepped out into the hallway, my flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The air felt thick, colder than it should have been. As I approached the kitchen, I could see the faintest shadow move across the floor. A figure, tall, thin, and moving unnaturally slow. I froze, too scared to make a sound, but the figure didn't seem to notice me. It just kept moving, dragging something behind it, its face hidden in the darkness. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to wake the others, but I couldn't move. I watched as the figure stopped in the middle of the kitchen, its back to me. Then it turned slowly, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It was pale, almost sickly white, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. The figure took a step forward, its movement jerky, like it was struggling to walk, and then it opened its mouth and whispered a word so softly I almost didn't hear it. "Leave." The voice was raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. I could feel the air grow colder, and I suddenly felt like I was suffocating. My mind raced, and all I could think was that we needed to leave. But before I could take another step, the figure vanished into the shadows. I ran back to my room and slammed the door shut. I tried to wake Andy, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. I just lay there, shaking, unable to sleep. The next morning, I told the others what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just a bad dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But when we went outside to hunt, something felt off. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and animals missing. We didn't find any tracks, no signs of life. It was like the entire forest was dead. By the time the sun began to set, we decided it was time to pack up and head home. We didn't talk much on the drive back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the trees, watching us leave. But there was nothing. We never spoke of what happened that night again. It's been years since that trip, but I can still remember the coldness, the eerie silence, and the sound of that whisper. The figure was gone, but the feeling stayed with me, and it always will. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The cold wind cut through the trees as I trudged through the thick snow, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. It was the dead of winter, and I had come to the family cabin to do what my father and his father before him had done: hunt. I'd been here countless times before, but this time was different. This time, I was alone. The cabin sat nestled at the edge of a thick forest, miles from the nearest town. I had grown up coming here with my dad, tracking deer and elk through the frozen woods, learning the ways of the land. My father had always been a quiet, no-nonsense man, but when we hunted together, it was as if the forest became a second home, and I could sense the bond between him and the land. Since his death 2 years ago, I hadn't come back. It just felt wrong to be here without him. But now, something in me needed to return, perhaps to relive the memories, or maybe to find some kind of peace. I had packed up the truck and driven in the night before, hoping to get a jump on the hunt early the next day. The snow was thick, the kind that had fallen silently throughout the night, blanketing the ground in an untouched layer of white. The trees seemed to stand motionless, their branches heavy with snow, and the air felt strangely still. By noon, I had covered a few miles into the forest. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't enough to drown out the strange feeling that had been nagging at the back of my mind since I'd arrived. The forest, usually so alive with the sounds of wildlife, was eerily quiet. No birds, no small animals darting between trees. It was as if something had silenced the woods. I hadn't seen any game yet, but that didn't bother me. I wasn't here for a big kill. I was here to be alone, to think. My father's death had left a gaping hole in my life, and the forest had always been my place of refuge, a place to clear my head. I paused at a small clearing, my breath heavy in my chest. The air was thick with snow, and the horizon seemed blurred, like I was walking through a dream. I glanced down at my boots, crunching in the snow, and noticed something odd. Fresh tracks. They were large, but not the kind of tracks left by deer. They were bigger, more like a person's, but too wide. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal, but as I crouched down to examine them, I noticed something strange. There was no sign of a trail beyond the prints, as if whatever had made them had simply appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared just as quickly. I stood up slowly, feeling a sense of unease creep up my spine. The tracks didn't make sense. There should have been more prints leading away from this spot, or at least a sign of where the creature had gone. But there was nothing, only these strange, large footprints leading in one direction. Curiosity won over caution, and I decided to follow them. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward an area I didn't recognize, a part of the woods my father had warned me to avoid. It was an old hunting ground, long abandoned, and he had always said there was something unnatural about the place. Of course, I'd never believed him, but as I followed the tracks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The trees grew denser and the snow seemed heavier here, as though it were thicker in this part of the forest. The silence was absolute, almost suffocating. Not even the wind dared to make a sound. I looked around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something in the air, something wrong. The tracks led me to a small, abandoned cabin, much older than the one I had stayed in. It was barely standing, the wood rotting and splintered, the roof caving in. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. A strange sense of dread washed over me, and I almost turned back, but something in me was compelled to go closer, to see what was inside. I approached the cabin cautiously, my hand on the rifle slung over my shoulder. The door creaked open on its hinges, and I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the wooden floorboards. The air inside was musty, damp with the scent of decay. It was as if time had stopped here, and nothing had moved since the day it was abandoned. A chill ran down my spine as I looked around the room, my eyes falling on an old wooden chair by the fire pit. The chair was facing the wall, as though someone had been sitting there, staring into the empty space. I took a step further inside, and that's when I saw it. Something dark in the corner of the room. My eyes went wide as I took a step back. There, in the shadows, was an old, tattered coat hanging from a hook on the wall. It was too worn to belong to anyone alive, and the fur collar had been shredded as if something had torn at it. But what really made my heart race was the sensation that someone had recently worn it. I quickly turned and rushed out of the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tracks had led me to this place, and the feeling in my gut told me I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. I wasn't sure if it was the memories of my father's warnings or the dread that had settled over me, but I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't look back as I hurried through the snow, retracing my steps toward the main trail. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was subtle at first, just a whisper of movement in the snow behind me. But as I quickened my pace, the sound seemed to grow louder, closer, until I could hear the crunch of footsteps in the snow, almost like someone was walking just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see another hunter or maybe a lost traveler, but there was nothing. I tried to push the fear down and keep moving, but the footsteps kept following me, too perfectly timed with mine. Every time I stopped to listen, they stopped too. When I sped up, they sped up. I was no longer alone in the woods. At this point, panic set in. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I broke into a run. My breath came in gasps, but the footsteps behind me didn't falter. It was as if whoever or whatever it was had been with me the whole time, watching me, waiting for me to realize it. The snow seemed to get thicker, the trees closing in on me, and I felt like I was being drawn deeper into the woods, further from safety. Finally, I reached the clearing near the cabin, where the trees seemed to part and open up. I could see the smoke from the cabin's chimney in the distance. But before I could reach it, I heard something else, a low, guttural growl. It was the kind of sound you would expect from a wild animal, but it wasn't coming from any animal I knew. It was closer than I cared to think about, just beyond the trees. I didn't hesitate any longer. I ran, ignoring the burning in my legs, the sharp cold that bit at my skin. The growl echoed behind me, growing louder, but I didn't dare turn around. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps, but the woods outside were silent once again. I spent the rest of the day in that cabin, watching through the windows, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. But nothing came. The forest was still, the wind now only a faint whisper in the distance. It wasn't until nightfall, when the fire burned low, that I felt the presence again, something pressing against the door, as if trying to get in. The footsteps outside resumed, slow and deliberate, but this time they didn't stop. I spent the night listening to those footsteps, hearing them circle the cabin, feeling as if something was waiting for me to make a mistake. In the morning, when the first light broke through the trees, I packed up and left. I didn't look back. To this day, I still don't know what I encountered in those woods. Whether it was something from the land itself or perhaps a lingering spirit from long ago, I'll never know, but I never went back. The silence in the forest that winter still haunts me. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
I had been hunting in the same woods since I was a child, the kind of place where the trees seem to whisper in the wind and the snow falls in a thick, quiet blanket. My grandfather taught me the ways of the forest, how to track, how to be still, and how to respect the land. He used to say the forest takes care of you if you respect it, but if you're careless, it will remind you of your place. When he passed, I inherited the cabin he built in the middle of those woods, a small, rugged place that felt like the heart of everything I had known. My family had always been hunters, and it was in the winter months that we did our best work, tracking the game that was hidden in the cold. But over the years, the hunt had become something different for me. I had stopped hunting for food and started hunting for peace, a way to get away from the noise of the world. This winter was no different. The snow had come early, and the temperatures had dropped with a sharp bite that made every breath feel like ice. I had set up camp in the same spot I always did, by the old oak near the ridge. The spot was good for deer, and though I wasn't expecting much, I figured I could get some time in the woods and clear my head. I was about a mile into the forest when I noticed the tracks. They were fresh, too fresh. There was no mistaking the deep impressions in the snow. Someone or something had passed this way very recently. The prints were strange, though, too large for a deer and too wide. It looked like something with a heavy, deliberate gait. I leaned down to inspect them, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. The snow around the prints wasn't disturbed, but the tracks led off into the trees where the branches hung low and blocked the light. I decided to follow them. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else, but I felt drawn to them. The forest was eerily silent around me, the only sound, the crunch of my boots on the snow and the occasional gust of wind that swept through the pines. I followed the tracks for what felt like hours deep into the heart of the woods, until I realized I was far from the familiar trails I knew. The trees were denser here, the snow thick with the weight of the storm that had passed through earlier. The tracks led me to a clearing, an area I didn't recognize. In the center of the clearing was a large, jagged rock, partially buried in the snow. The footprints stopped at its base, and there were no further signs of movement. I paused, trying to catch my breath, feeling the cold air cutting through my jacket. Something about the place felt off, like the trees themselves were watching me. I took a few cautious steps forward, my rifle at my side, my senses on high alert. The clearing felt too still, too unnatural. There was an odd heaviness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. The wind had died down completely, and the only sound now was the faint crunch of snow beneath my boots. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was barely audible at first, like a voice carried on the wind. I froze, listening intently. It sounded like a name, my name, or at least something close to it. My heart began to race, and I slowly turned in place, scanning the trees around me. I didn't see anything. Just the long, dark shadows cast by the branches and the heavy, oppressive silence of the forest. I should have turned back then. The feeling in my chest was tight, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But I stood frozen, staring into the distance, when something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, near a thick stand of pines. It was tall, too tall for any person I had ever seen in the woods, and its shape was wrong, unnatural. It stood motionless, its features hidden beneath the shadows of the trees. For a moment, I thought it might be a trick of the light, some kind of hallucination brought on by the cold and the isolation. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the figure stepped forward, the snow beneath its feet not crunching as it should. It was as if it glided across the ground. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no eyes, just a shape, a presence that made the air feel heavier, colder. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn, and never look back. But I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure took another step toward me, and then another. It was closer now, so close I could feel the shift in the air, the temperature dropping as though it were sucking all the warmth from the forest around it. I reached for my rifle, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the strap. The figure stopped just at the edge of the clearing, watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. I didn't know if it was a person or something else entirely, but I had to know. I had to be sure. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, like some ancient sentinel guarding the forest. I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement, a shadow in the space where its face should have been. But I couldn't be sure. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but the figure didn't budge. It remained in the same spot, unyielding, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked, and it was as if the figure had evaporated into thin air. The clearing was empty, the trees were still, the snow fell gently, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing. What had I seen? Had I imagined it? Was I losing my grip on reality out here in the woods alone? I didn't know. But I wasn't staying to find out. I turned and ran, the sound of my boots crunching in the snow the only thing I could hear. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. My body moved on autopilot, my feet carrying me back toward the cabin, away from the clearing and the woods that had suddenly become so much more than I was prepared for. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in my bones. I stood there for a long time, my hands trembling, unsure if I should even trust myself. Had it been real? Had it been a ghost? A hallucination? I didn't know, and the not knowing was worse than anything else. I didn't sleep that night. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the clearing. I kept hearing that whisper in the back of my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it lingered. The next day, I packed up and left the woods earlier than I'd planned. The tracks were gone, the clearing was untouched, and I could see nothing that would explain what I had seen. But the woods felt different now, darker, heavier, like they were hiding something, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I've been back to the cabin a few times since then, but I've never gone as deep into the woods again. It's not that I'm afraid exactly, it's just I don't belong there anymore. The woods have changed, and so have I. And no matter how much I want to believe it was just a bad dream, part of me knows I wasn't the only one walking those trails that day. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I didn't believe in ghosts. I thought it was all nonsense, just the stuff of campfire stories, things people told to spook themselves and their kids at night. I'd grown up in the woods, hunting with my father, and later on my own, learning how to track, how to survive in the cold. The woods were my refuge, my place of peace. They had always been my father's too, and when he died, I inherited the family cabin, tucked away deep in the mountains where we had spent so many winters hunting. It was late December when I made my first trip back to the cabin since my father passed away. I didn't expect it to feel so empty. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it. Familiar smells, familiar creaks in the floorboards, but this time it was different. The silence in the air was thicker. The snow had been falling for days, and the woods were coated in a blanket of white, stretching endlessly into the horizon. It looked like a painting, beautiful but desolate. I'd come here to hunt, to find some peace and maybe shake off the memories that had been lingering since my father's death. He had taught me everything I knew about hunting, and I'd learned the woods better than the back of my hand. It was supposed to be a time to reflect, to reconnect with the land. I woke early the next morning, the cold creeping in through the gaps in the walls. I wasn't surprised. The old cabin was always drafty in the winter, but it was warm enough with the fire going. I dressed in layers and set out for the woods, the rifle slung over my shoulder. The crunch of snow beneath my boots was the only sound as I walked along the familiar path that led deeper into the forest. I was a couple of miles into the woods before I noticed something strange. The forest felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the air was still unnaturally still. Normally, there would be the sounds of birds, small animals darting through the underbrush, but everything was quiet. Not even the wind stirred the treetops. It was as though the forest had gone to sleep and forgotten to wake up. The deeper I went, the stronger that feeling of unease grew. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just the loneliness of being out here without my father. But the longer I walked, the heavier the silence became. I paused at a large tree to catch my breath, scanning the area for any signs of deer or elk, but there was nothing. Just snow stretching in every direction. I took a few more steps forward when I spotted something in the distance, footprints in the snow. They were large, too large for any animal I knew. At first, I thought they might belong to a bear or some other large creature, but they were too round, too deliberate. Someone had been walking through the snow, and their tracks led further into the woods. I hesitated. I had never seen anyone else out here. This part of the forest was far from any main trail, and no one had used the cabin in years. The idea that someone else was out here, especially in this weather, didn't sit right with me. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the tracks. I moved slowly, my eyes darting around the trees, listening for any signs of movement. The footprints led deeper into the woods, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as though the woods themselves were watching me. I followed the tracks for what seemed like miles, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the air growing colder with each step. Finally, I came to a small clearing. The tracks ended at the base of an old, decaying tree. There was something odd about it. The tree had been here for as long as I could remember, but the ground around it was disturbed, as though something had been dug up recently. I crouched down, examining the area. There was a patch of earth that had been turned over, and next to it, a rusted old axe was stuck in the ground. I reached for the axe, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, and immediately felt a chill run through me. It wasn't just the cold of the winter air, it was something else. Something wrong. A shiver ran down my spine as I pulled the axe out of the ground. Something wasn't right. The air had changed. There was a heaviness now, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't ignore. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in around me. I looked around the clearing, but there was no sign of anyone. No other tracks, no movement in the trees. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, coming from behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the snow, and the heavy silence. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breath, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. It was a low, dragging sound, like something heavy moving through the snow. I started to back away, my hand instinctively going to the rifle at my side. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A cougar? But the sound was too deliberate, too slow. It wasn't an animal. I could feel it. Whatever it was human. Or at least it had once been. I turned and ran, not looking back, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I pushed through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart was racing, my body burning with fear as I tore through the trees, the rustling sounds still following me, never getting closer, but never disappearing. It was as though it was always just behind me, dragging itself through the snow. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking. The wind howled outside, but the rustling had stopped. The silence returned, but now it was even more oppressive. My pulse was still racing, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, to get away from whatever was out there in the woods. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing inside the cabin, trying to shake off the fear that gripped me. I checked the windows, but there was nothing. No movement in the snow, no signs of life outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something was waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't leave the cabin that night. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it couldn't chase away the cold that had settled in my bones. I stayed up late, listening to every creak of the wood, every shift of the wind. But the sound of footsteps or dragging never came again. The next morning, the sun broke through the trees, and the world outside seemed as still and quiet as it had been before. I packed up my things, determined to leave and never come back. As I walked out the door, I glanced one last time at the tree where I had found the axe. The snow around it was undisturbed now, and the ground looked as if nothing had ever been there. But something told me it wasn't over. I didn't know what I had felt out there in the woods, but it was something I would never forget. The unease, the dragging sound, the feeling that I was being hunted. It was all too real. And I still hear it sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the dark, the faint rustling, the dragging sound, like something is still out there waiting for me to return. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The winter wind howled through the trees, a biting, unrelenting gust that seemed to have a life of its own. Beneath the cold, the forest appeared lifeless, with snow-heavy branches bending under the weight of the night's chill. Far from civilization, the woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, the horizon consumed by an abyss of white. It was the kind of night that only the most seasoned hunters dared to venture into. David and his brother Peter had been hunting since they were children. They had spent countless winters in these woods, tracking deer, rabbits, and whatever else they could find, always careful to respect the land. But tonight was different. Tonight, the forest felt wrong, as if it were alive and watching them. David could feel it in the way the trees creaked and groaned with each gust of wind, the way the snow crunched underfoot like brittle bones. They had made camp earlier, a small fire crackling against the dark, its warmth a temporary reprieve from the biting cold. The stars above were obscured by thick clouds, and the moon hung low, a pale ghostly sliver in the sky. The night had taken on an oppressive stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. No animals stirred, not even the usual nocturnal sounds of the forest. "You sure about this?" Peter asked, his breath visible in the cold air as he looked at David, who was sharpening his knife. David didn't answer right away. He had always been the more serious of the two, the one who would push them to venture deeper, go farther, test their limits. But something in his gut gnawed at him tonight. He had heard the stories of the woods, old legends passed down by the locals, tales of strange happenings, whispers of hunters who had gone missing over the years. But those were just stories, right? "Yeah, we'll be fine," David said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He forced a smile, more for Peter's sake than his own. The brothers had set their sights on a large buck that had been seen in the area recently, its tracks evident in the snow around their camp. It was a prize, one that would make their efforts in the woods worthwhile. But as they set out toward the heart of the forest, the shadows seemed to close in around them. David noticed how the wind had stopped entirely, leaving the world unnervingly silent. "Maybe we should head back," Peter said after a while, his voice tense. David shook his head. "We've come this far. Let's just push through." They continued through the forest, the trees thinning as they made their way to the clearing where the buck was rumored to roam. The trail was fresh, the snow packed with the unmistakable marks of hooves. The moonlight filtered weakly through the thick canopy, casting strange, distorted shadows across the snow. The air grew colder still, biting through their clothing and numbing their limbs. But David refused to turn back. He was determined to bag the buck, to prove that he could bring something substantial back from this hunt. After all, it wasn't just about the meat or the trophy. It was about conquering the woods. Suddenly, Peter stopped. His breath hitched, and he looked around nervously. "What's wrong?" David asked, turning to him. Peter swallowed, his face pale. "I thought I heard something, like a whisper." David furrowed his brow, trying to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. "It's probably just the wind." Peter didn't seem convinced. No, it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. David glanced around but saw nothing unusual. The forest was empty, save for the rustling of trees in the distance. "Come on, we're almost there." They pushed on, the silence growing heavier, suffocating. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, came a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. It wasn't like any animal they'd ever heard before. David's heart skipped a beat, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But before he could voice his concern, a shape moved in the corner of his eye. A figure, barely visible in the shadow of the trees, stood watching them. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for a human. Its head was slightly tilted as if studying them, and its face, if it could be called a face, was obscured by the darkness, though David could feel its eyes on him, cold and piercing. "David," Peter whispered, his voice shaking. David didn't answer. His throat was dry, and his legs felt as if they were cemented to the ground. The figure moved again, but this time, it was closer. Far too close. "Run!" Peter shouted, his voice breaking the spell. Without thinking, David turned and bolted back toward the camp. He could hear Peter's footsteps behind him, the sound of snow crunching beneath their boots as they tore through the forest. But the figure was still following them. The growl echoed again, this time louder, angrier. It was chasing them. David could hear it getting closer with every step, its presence pressing in on them from all sides. The trees seemed to warp and twist as they ran, the shadows lengthening unnaturally, as though the forest itself were alive and trying to swallow them whole. David's breath came in ragged gasps, and he could feel the sweat on his brow despite the cold. He glanced behind him, but the figure was gone, lost in the darkness. For a moment, he thought they were safe. Then Peter screamed. David whipped around to see his brother struggling against something, no, someone, that was pulling him into the woods. The figure, now fully visible, stood towering over Peter, its gaunt, pale face twisted in a grotesque grin, its long fingers wrapped around Peter's arm, dragging him toward the trees. "Peter!" David shouted, charging forward. But his legs were too slow, the figure was too fast. Peter was yanked into the darkness, his cries fading as the woods swallowed him whole. David stumbled to a stop, his mind reeling, heart racing. He was alone now. The creature was gone, taking Peter with it. The fire. His first instinct was to run back to the campfire, but as he turned, he saw the figure standing between him and the warmth. Its eyes gleamed in the moonlight, and it opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. David's breath caught in his throat as the world around him seemed to close in. The figure was not just hunting them. It had been waiting for them to cross into its domain. and now it would claim him too. Suddenly, the forest came alive with sounds, the wind howling, trees creaking, and somewhere in the distance, the faintest sound of footsteps. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. He was already running again, sprinting toward the safety of the fire, his only chance to survive. But the woods around him seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling him further from where he needed to be, the darkness pressing closer with each step. As he reached the clearing, he saw the figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the camp. It was watching him, waiting. David stopped, frozen in place. He knew he was too far gone. The woods had claimed them both. And then, as the cold night swallowed him whole, he heard Peter's voice again, a whisper on the wind. Help! Me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The air was bitterly cold, a harsh reminder of the wilderness surrounding the small cabin in the northern woods. It was late January, the heart of winter, and there were 4 of them. 4 men gathered around a roaring fire inside the cabin. Ben, Jake, and Dave had driven up from the city, seeking solitude, a break from their hectic lives. A weekend of winter hunting seemed like the perfect escape. The snow was deep, the roads impassable to anyone who didn't know the way, which suited them just fine. The isolation was part of the charm. The cabin itself was nothing special, a simple 2-room structure with a wood stove for heat and an old hunting rifle leaning by the door. The walls were adorned with faded pictures of past hunts and old animal pelts, but there was something about the place that gave Ben an uneasy feeling, as if it had seen too many seasons of hunters pass through, some with good intentions and some with darker ones. Still, he tried to dismiss the feeling. It was just the cold, the isolation, and the unfamiliarity of being so far from civilization. The day had been spent trudging through the snow, hunting for deer and elk. The hunt was successful, but not without its challenges. The snow was so deep that it felt like walking through an endless sea of white, and the cold was biting. By the time they made their way back to the cabin, the sun had already dipped behind the horizon, and the sky was painted with streaks of purple and orange. As the fire crackled and they sat around the table, eating the meat they had harvested that day, Jake began telling one of his usual ghost stories. The man loved a good scare, especially in the dark, quiet surroundings of the woods. He had a way of making the stories sound real, as if they had happened to him personally, though none of the group truly believed him. It's just like the old hunting stories from these parts, Jake began, his voice lowering to a more ominous tone. You know, the ones about hunters who never came back. Mike laughed, raising his beer. Come on, Jake. You really expect us to believe that crap? I'm serious, Jake continued, his eyes wide. There's something about these woods. People talk about it, but nobody ever seems to stick around long enough to tell the tale. You go too deep into the woods, and you might just find yourself lost, but not in the way you'd expect. Ben shook his head, trying to brush it off. It was cold, and the fire was starting to lose some of its warmth. Let's just eat, okay? We're not here to talk about ghost stories. But Jake wasn't done. No, listen. People say they've seen things. Figures moving between the trees, shadows that don't belong, strange noises when there's no wind. I'm sure it's just the wind, Dave said, trying to sound practical. You're hearing things. Ben didn't want to admit it, but Jake's words had left a lingering feeling in his chest. He had noticed it too, the way the woods felt different when the night came. The wind howled through the trees with an unsettling energy, and every now and then Ben swore he saw something moving in the distance, just out of sight. I'll be honest, Ben spoke up, breaking the uneasy silence. I don't feel right here. There's something about this place. You're just getting jumpy, Mike said with a laugh. You've had too much beer, my friend. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling. Something was watching them. He couldn't explain it, but every time he looked out the window, he thought he saw figures moving through the trees. The shadows seemed to move on their own, growing longer with every passing minute. It was unnerving, but he didn't want to show the others he was scared. The conversation moved on, but Ben couldn't focus. His eyes kept drifting to the window, where the dark woods stretched out, silent and heavy with snow. Every so often he would hear a twig snap or the faint crunch of snow underfoot. But when he looked out, there was nothing, just the endless white expanse. As the night wore on, the fire died down to embers. The temperature in the cabin dropped, and Ben could see his breath as he exhaled. The others didn't seem to mind, but Ben felt like something was pressing in from all sides. The wind had died down, but it still felt suffocating. "I'm heading to bed," Ben said, standing up abruptly. "I'll see you guys in the morning." The others nodded, too wrapped up in their conversation to pay him much attention. He trudged upstairs to the small loft where his bed was. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he climbed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was up there, waiting. He paused at the top, listening, but the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire downstairs. Ben tried to shake it off, pulling the blankets tight around him. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. He lay there in the dark, listening to the silence. Every now and then he heard a soft noise, a thud, a creak of wood, like someone was walking around downstairs. It made no sense. The others were all in bed, and there was no one else in the cabin. He finally decided to get up and check. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on him. He grabbed the small flashlight from his bag and made his way down the stairs, every step seeming louder in the silence. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped dead in his tracks. The door to the main room was wide open. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. He had clearly shut it before heading to bed. Slowly, he crept forward, his flashlight shaking in his hands. The fire still burned low in the hearth, and casting eerie shadows across the room. He stepped inside, but the room was empty. Nothing was disturbed. Suddenly, a sound came from outside the cabin, a crunch of snow, heavy and deliberate. Ben froze, holding his breath. There was something out there. He could feel it. Slowly, he moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible in the snowstorm. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Ben's pulse quickened. He blinked, and the figure was gone. He stepped back from the window, his mind racing. It had to be one of the others playing a prank on him, but when he turned around to check, the cabin was still empty. He grabbed his rifle, knowing he couldn't be sure of anything anymore. His footsteps were loud on the wooden floor as he made his way to the door, but before he could open it, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. Ben froze again, looking toward the sound. It came from upstairs. He wasn't sure what to do, but every instinct told him he couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. He bolted up the stairs, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. But when he reached the loft, he found the others gone. The beds were empty, the blankets thrown aside as if they had been in a hurry to leave. His heart raced as he scanned the room, but there was no sign of his friends. He turned to the window, and that's when he saw it. There, in the woods, standing just outside the tree line, was the same figure from before. It wasn't a man. It was something else, tall, gaunt, and impossibly still. Ben's blood ran cold. The door slammed shut behind him, and the lights flickered. In the darkness, Ben heard a voice, low and guttural, whispering just behind him. "Leave now." Ben didn't hesitate. He ran for the door, flinging it open and sprinting into the snow, the cold biting at his skin. The wind howled, the world around him a blur of white and shadow. As he reached the edge of the trees, he looked back one last time. The cabin was dark, silent, empty, and the figure was gone. Ben never returned to that cabin. He couldn't explain what had happened, but he knew one thing. The woods, the snow, the isolation, it had all been part of something much darker, something that hunted in the silence. Story the end.
Story number 8.
We had been planning our winter hunting trip for months. The plan was simple. Get away from the noise of the world, head to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and spend a few days hunting in the snow-covered wilderness. The four of us, me, my cousin Jack, our old friend Nate, and my brother Luke, had done these trips before, but this one, for reasons I still don't understand, felt different from the start. The cabin we rented was in the northern part of the Adirondacks, deep into the wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. The weather forecast called for heavy snow, which suited us just fine. We were experienced hunters and had braved the harshest conditions. But there was something about this place, this trip, that didn't sit right with me. We arrived in the late afternoon as the sun was beginning to sink behind the trees. The cabin was small but sturdy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. A heavy layer of snow had already blanketed the ground, and the wind was picking up. The cabin's owner, a man named Henry, had left the key under the mat for us, but we never saw him in person, just a brief note on the table saying he hoped we enjoyed our stay. Inside, the place felt old, even though it didn't appear to be. The walls were lined with wood, the air smelled of aged timber, and the furnishings were sparse but functional. A wood stove sat in the corner of the living room, which we were told would keep us warm enough throughout our stay. After unloading our gear, we built a fire and settled in. Jack cracked open a beer, Nate opened his hunting journal, and Luke began preparing our rifles for the next day's hunt. The atmosphere in the cabin was cozy, but as night fell, the outside world grew eerily silent. The wind howled, but there were no other sounds. No animals, no rustling of trees, nothing. It was Luke who first noticed something unusual. He was staring out the window, his face frozen in confusion. "Hey, you guys see that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. We all moved toward the window and peered into the dark. At first, I saw nothing. But then, as the wind shifted, the snow seemed to swirl in a strange way, as though something was moving through it. Something large. "It's probably a deer," Jack said dismissively, but his voice wavered slightly. Nate agreed, but I wasn't so sure. But the shape moving through the snow didn't look right. It was too slow, too deliberate. The figure seemed to drift through the forest, almost gliding without leaving a clear trail in the snow. It didn't move like any animal I had ever seen. "Should we check it out?" I asked, my curiosity beginning to get the better of me. Luke hesitated. "It's late. Maybe we should just let it be." But something inside me told me we couldn't let it go. So we grabbed our rifles, bundled up in our winter gear, and stepped out into the freezing cold night. The wind whipped at our faces, and the snow fell in heavy, swirling sheets. We moved cautiously toward the area where we had seen the figure. As we stepped into the forest, the trees were thick with snow. The world around us was muffled, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots in the snow. We followed the vague outline of where the figure had been, but the deeper we went, the stranger the scene became. The tracks in the snow were unlike anything I had ever seen. They weren't the paw prints of any animal, nor were they human. The shapes were elongated, with deep indentations, like something heavy had walked through the snow. But what caught my attention most was how they seemed to wander aimlessly, circling back on themselves, moving in a way that no animal would. We followed the tracks for what felt like hours, each of us growing more unsettled by the minute. The cold seemed to seep into our bones and the silence was suffocating. At one point we heard a sound, a soft, distant scraping, like something dragging across the ground. We froze, listening. The wind howled, but the scraping sound persisted, growing louder, closer. "Do you hear that?" Nate whispered. We all nodded, though none of us spoke. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. It was fleeting just for a moment, but it was there. I turned toward it, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing between the trees, watching us. But before I could say anything, the figure was gone. "Let's go back," Luke said, his voice tense. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and began walking back toward the cabin, our pace quickening as the scraping sound grew louder, following us. The tracks in the snow led us back to the clearing where the cabin sat. We didn't stop until we were inside, locking the door behind us. For the rest of the night, we stayed in the cabin, trying to brush off what had happened. We made small talk, drank more beer, and pretended like everything was normal. But none of us slept that night. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows had us on edge. The feeling of being watched never left. The next day, we went out hunting as planned, but the entire forest seemed different. The air was heavier, the trees more oppressive. The wind picked up again, and the snow began to fall harder. We moved through the woods, but there was no game in sight. Not a single deer, rabbit, or bird. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. By noon, we were all ready to head back to the cabin. The eerie feeling had only grown stronger, and none of us wanted to be out there any longer than necessary. As we walked back, Nate stopped suddenly, his eyes wide. "You guys see that?" he asked, pointing toward a group of trees just off to the side. We turned, but there was nothing there, nothing but the thick wall of snow and trees. The wind howled around us, and the snow swirled like a veil. But then, for a moment, I thought I saw something moving. a figure, standing at the edge of the woods, partially obscured by the snow. "Do you see it?" I asked Luke. He didn't answer, but his face was pale, his eyes fixed on the spot. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. It wasn't like a person walking away, it simply vanished. We didn't wait around. We turned and headed back to the cabin as quickly as we could. Once inside, we huddled around the stove, trying to shake off the cold. But the unease lingered, pressing down on us like a weight. That night, no one spoke much. We could hear strange sounds from outside, footsteps in the snow, scraping, distant whispers. But whenever we opened the door or looked out the window, there was nothing there. By the morning, we'd had enough. We packed up our gear, loaded up the truck, and left the cabin behind. The drive back to civilization was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Every now and then, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us in the snow, but there was nothing. We never went back to that cabin. None of us spoke about what had happened in the woods. The eerie silence, the strange figures, the sense of being followed, it all stayed with us, lingering in the back of our minds. And to this day, when winter comes and the snow begins to fall, I can't help but wonder if that thing in the woods is still out there, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
It was the first week of January when my friends and I decided to head out for our annual winter hunting trip. We had done this many times before, but something felt different about this one. Maybe it was because of the deep snow that had piled up the week before, or the unusually cold winds that swept through the forest. But for whatever reason, when we set out to the secluded cabin we rented, there was a palpable sense of unease that none of us could ignore. The cabin was in a remote part of the Adirondacks, far enough from any towns that we were completely isolated from civilization. The drive-in was long and treacherous, and the weather was only getting worse. The sky had been overcast for days, and the snowstorm had started in the late afternoon, blanketing the world in a heavy, silent white. There was a sense of quiet out there in the woods that felt oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. It was me, my cousin Ryan, and our two friends, Mark and Jack, who had agreed to make the trip. We had been hunting together for years, ever since we were teenagers, but none of us had ever experienced anything like the strange events that unfolded during this trip. Looking back now, I'm convinced that we disturbed something in those woods, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. The cabin itself was exactly as we remembered it from past trips. It was small but functional, with an old wood-burning stove in the living room, a couple of bedrooms, and a sparse kitchen. The owner, a reclusive man named Henry, had been kind enough to leave a note with instructions on how to maintain the stove and where to find the wood. There was something strange about Henry, though, something off-putting that none of us could quite explain. He was always too quiet, too reserved. It was clear he didn't like to talk much about the area, and that made us uneasy, but we didn't let it bother us too much. Once we arrived and got settled, we went out for a short hunt before dark. The snow was thick and the wind had picked up, but we pressed on, knowing the storm would only get worse as the evening went on. We didn't expect to find much, given the weather, but we were hoping to at least get a few good hours of hunting in. That's when it happened. As we moved deeper into the woods, we noticed something odd. The tracks in the snow didn't seem like normal animal prints. They were large, too large for any deer or bear, with long, deep indentations that looked almost like human footprints, but much wider and more elongated. I remember Ryan being the first to notice them. He pointed out how they seemed to move in a strange pattern, like whatever left them was walking in circles. "What the hell is this?" Ryan muttered, crouching down to examine one of the prints more closely. His breath misted in the cold air as he ran a finger over the snow. "It's not an animal," Mark said, his voice low. "It's too big for that." We all stood there for a moment, staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them. The wind was picking up again, and the snow started to fall heavier. Jack, ever the skeptic, suggested that it was probably just someone else from the area who had been walking around, but none of us bought that. We were miles away from the nearest road, and it seemed impossible that anyone would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm. We decided to head back to the cabin before the storm grew worse, but as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every so often I'd glance over my shoulder, but the trees were too thick to see much. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an uneasy sense of being watched. Ryan, Mark, and Jack seemed to sense it too, because we all quickened our pace, almost instinctively. When we made it back to the cabin, we tried to brush off the strange experience. The fire was roaring in the stove, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. It was easy to forget about the odd tracks in the snow as we sat around the warmth of the fire, cracking open beers and reminiscing about old hunting trips. But as the evening wore on, a strange tension began to settle over us. It was as if the storm outside was amplifying something in the air, something that didn't belong. Around 10 p.m., we heard a noise from outside, a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. At first, we all ignored it, thinking it was just the wind or a branch falling from one of the trees. But then it happened again, closer this time, followed by a scraping sound, like something dragging across the snow. I could feel my heart rate pick up. The others heard it too because they went silent, and we all exchanged uneasy glances. "What the hell is that?" Jack whispered, his voice strained. "I don't know," Mark replied, his eyes wide with unease. Ryan stood up and walked to the window, peering out through the blinds. "There's nothing out there," he said after a long moment. "Maybe it's an animal, something big." But I wasn't so sure. The sound had been too deliberate, too purposeful. The scraping noise continued, getting louder and closer until it was right outside the door. "I'm going to check," Ryan said, grabbing his rifle from the wall. "Stay here." He opened the door slowly, stepping out into the darkness. The wind howled, and the snow swirled around him like a veil, but there was nothing. No sign of what had been making the noise. After a few minutes, Ryan came back inside, looking confused and unsettled. "There's nothing out there," he said, his voice tight. But I swear, it felt like something was watching me. The rest of the night passed uneasily. We sat in front of the fire, trying to ignore the strange sounds coming from outside. Every now and then we heard the scraping noise again, but whenever we looked out the windows or opened the door, we found nothing. The next morning, we woke up to a scene of absolute silence. The snow had stopped falling and everything was covered in a thick blanket of white. It was beautiful, in a way, but the eerie feeling from the night before still lingered. We decided to go out hunting again, hoping to shake off the unease. But when we stepped outside, we were met with an unsettling sight. The tracks from the previous day had returned, but they were now much closer to the cabin, almost as if something had been circling the house overnight. The prints were fresh, the snow undisturbed, but the pattern was the same as before. Large, elongated tracks that seemed to wind in and out of the trees, moving in a circle around the cabin. "That's not possible," Ryan muttered. "There's no way anyone could have walked around the house in the middle of the night without us hearing them." We followed the tracks again, this time staying much closer to the cabin. The further we went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt wrong, like the trees themselves were closing in on us. The air was thick, and every rustle of branches made my heart skip a beat. When we reached the edge of the woods, we saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. It was tall, too tall, and it was just standing there motionless, watching us. We couldn't make out any features, but we all saw it, and the air around us seemed to freeze. "Get back to the cabin," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "Now." We turned and ran, not looking back until we were safely inside. The door slammed shut behind us, and we locked it. We didn't speak for a long time, each of us processing what we had just seen. The figure, that feeling of being watched, it all became too much. That night, we didn't hear any noises from outside, but the feeling of dread was palpable. The wind howled and the storm picked up again, but none of us dared to go back outside. We stayed close to the fire, our rifles at the ready, waiting for morning. The next day, we packed up and left early. None of us spoke much during the drive back, but I could feel the weight of something unspoken between us. Whatever we had disturbed in those woods, we didn't want to find out what it was. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It was shrouded in mist, the snow still falling around it, but there was no sign of movement. Still, the feeling lingered. like something was waiting in the trees, watching us leave. We never went back. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The snow had been falling heavily for hours, thick flakes swirling in the air as the world around the cabin became an isolated, frozen wasteland. Ben and his friends had come to the northern wilderness to hunt, seeking the thrill of the chase, far from the comfort of their homes. They had rented a small, rustic cabin, surrounded by thick woods, and spent the day hunting deer, only to return to their refuge as darkness fell. As they gathered inside, stoking the fire and setting out cold beers, the wind outside howled like a hungry animal. The place was quiet, too quiet. They hadn't seen another soul in miles. The others were talking and laughing, but Ben couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Something about this place felt wrong, like it was holding secrets too dark to share. "It's just the wilderness getting to you, Ben," said Jake, slapping him on the back. "Nothing to worry about out here." Ben nodded, trying to push the feeling down. He was an experienced hunter, familiar with the silence and the strange way the woods could make a person feel isolated. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. Night deepened, and the wind continued to scream against the cabin's wooden walls. The temperature dropped, and despite the fire crackling in the hearth, the chill crept into their bones. Ben stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the night was black, save for the moonlight reflecting off the snow. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, their gnarled branches reaching up like skeletal hands. "Ben, you good?" Jake asked, noticing his restless pacing. "Yeah, just got this weird feeling," Ben replied, still staring into the darkness outside. "That's just the cold getting to you. Come on, let's eat." The group settled around the table, eating their simple dinner, but Ben's mind was elsewhere. His eyes darted back to the window every few moments. His unease had grown into something more. He didn't know what it was, but there was a presence outside the cabin, something lurking, something waiting. Later that night, as the fire burned low, the group retired to their rooms. Ben's bed was in a small loft above the main floor, a quiet space with a view of the surrounding woods. He lay there, listening to the sound of the wind, unable to sleep. He kept hearing noises, cracks, distant thuds, the snap of a branch. But the wind was fierce, and he tried to convince himself it was nothing more than the storm. But then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps outside the cabin, crunching through the snow. Ben's heart raced, and he pushed himself up, peering through the small window from his loft. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. There was nothing, but he could still hear the footsteps, as if someone or something was pacing outside just beyond the reach of the light. He grabbed his rifle and crept downstairs, careful not to wake the others. As he stepped into the snow, the chill hit him like a slap to the face. The air was thick with frost, and the wind carried a bitter, metallic scent. He stepped cautiously, scanning the area. Nothing. No tracks in the snow. The ground was untouched. The footsteps had vanished. Ben felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His breath came out in visible puffs as he stood there, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. He was alone in the dark wilderness, but something told him he wasn't alone at all. It wasn't the wind or the storm. There was something in the woods watching him, waiting. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft whisper, as if the wind had caught a voice. Ben turned sharply, his rifle raised, but there was no one there. He called out, his voice breaking the silence of the night. "Hello, is someone out there?" No answer. Just the sound of the wind. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but nothing moved. The woods were still. Too still. He turned to go back inside when he heard it again, a low growl, deep and guttural. It seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the trees. Ben's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His eyes darted around, trying to locate the source of the sound. The growl came again, closer this time. And then he saw it, a figure, dark and indistinct, moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, much taller than any man. Its body was thin and twisted, almost like a skeleton wrapped in tattered skin. The moonlight barely illuminated it, but Ben could make out the hollow, black eyes staring at him. It was watching him. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped backward. He raised his rifle, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, waiting. Then, without warning, it lunged. Ben fired. The shot echoed through the woods, the sound almost swallowed by the snowstorm. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, faster than any human should be able to move. Ben ran, stumbling through the deep snow, his breath ragged in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from whatever that thing was. Behind him, the growl grew louder, more frantic. He could hear the footsteps now, closing in, the sound of something large and heavy crashing through the woods. Ben's legs burned with the effort to run, but he couldn't outrun whatever was hunting him. He glanced over his shoulder, his breath misting in the freezing air. The creature was close now, almost upon him. Ben fired again, but the shot went wild, the creature's dark shape flickering in and out of the trees like a shadow. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. The growling ceased, and the woods were silent again. Ben stopped, chest heaving, and looked around. There was no sign of the thing. No movement, no sound. He stood there for a long moment, trying to catch his breath. Had it been a figment of his imagination? Had he really seen it? But the fear in his gut told him otherwise. He had to get back to the cabin. He had to warn the others. Ben made his way back, his eyes darting through the trees, waiting for the thing to reappear. But nothing came. When he reached the cabin, he hurried inside, slamming the door behind him. The others were still asleep, oblivious to the terror that had gripped Ben. He stood there, staring at the door, the rifle still clutched in his hands. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he could explain what had happened. What if they thought he was losing his mind? He collapsed on the couch, his eyes never leaving the door. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark figure in the woods, its hollow eyes locked on him. The growl, the chase, it all replayed in his mind over and over. The storm raged through the night, and the next morning, the others woke, none the wiser to the horrors that had unfolded outside. Ben didn't tell them. He didn't have the words. Instead, they went out to hunt again, as if nothing had happened. But Ben knew. He knew they were not alone. Something was out there in the woods, something old, something hungry, and it was waiting for them. As they walked deeper into the forest, the snow falling softly around them, Ben heard it again, a whisper on the wind. He stopped, looking around, his heart in his throat. The others hadn't heard it, but Ben did. It was the growl, faint but unmistakable, creeping through the trees. And then, as he turned to speak to his friends, he saw it again, standing between the trees, just out of sight, the creature watching him with its dark, hollow eyes. Ben wasn't sure how much longer he could survive in this place. The woods were alive with something ancient, something that would never let them leave.
Story number 11.
The sun had barely set behind the mountain range when Ethan strapped his boots on and prepared to leave the cabin. It was late December, and the northern Minnesota winter had come early that year. The snow had fallen thick and heavy for the past few days, covering the ground in a blanket of white that made the woods look like a different world altogether. Ethan had been raised in these woods and spent nearly every winter hunting with his father. This year, however, he was alone. His father had passed away unexpectedly in the spring, and the cabin, though familiar, felt unnervingly empty. He grabbed his rifle, the familiar weight of it grounding him as he left the warmth of the cabin and stepped into the cold. The wind bit at his skin immediately, but he didn't mind it. This was the winter he knew, the world he was comfortable in. The vastness of the trees, the untouched snow, it all made him feel connected to something greater. His father's presence was still felt in the woods, in the quiet corners of the trails they had walked together. Ethan had come up to the cabin to clear his head, to take in the solitude of the woods and the silence. But tonight, he wasn't just walking for peace. He was hunting. The buck he had seen on the edge of the forest the previous week had stayed in his mind. He needed to track it, to prove to himself that he could still do this, that the hunt was still part of him. The air was cold and crisp, and the forest was alive with the sharp sounds of snow underfoot. Ethan walked with purpose, every step intentional, listening for the soft rustle of any game. The woods were silent, except for the occasional gust of wind that pushed through the branches overhead. He was accustomed to the quiet of winter, but tonight it felt different, strangely oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't long before he noticed something odd, a trail of blood. It wasn't much, just a few small drops in the snow, but it was enough to catch his attention. His heart rate picked up. A wounded animal, most likely the buck. He followed the trail carefully, moving slower now, the rifle ready in his hands. The blood led him deeper into the forest, away from the paths he knew so well and toward the dense thicket near the old clearing. Ethan had never ventured this far before. His father had warned him about this part of the forest, an area too close to the mountain pass, too close to the old logging trails. The stories his father used to tell him echoed in his mind. Tales of hunters who had gone missing, of strange sounds in the night, of figures moving just out of sight. Ethan had never believed them, until now. The blood trail grew darker, the spots more frequent, and soon it was clear that the animal had been bleeding heavily. But then the trail stopped, just stopped. No more blood, no more sign of the buck. Ethan stood in the snow, staring at the empty space where the trail had vanished. His breath fogged in the cold air, and the wind howled through the trees. He wasn't sure what to make of it. Had the animal simply wandered off, or was something else at play here? He took a step forward, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. That's when he heard it. A soft rustling, a crack of branches behind him. Ethan spun around, his rifle raised, but there was nothing there. The woods were still. For a moment he thought maybe it had been the wind, but then he heard it again, a faint, guttural whisper coming from the direction of the clearing. "Get out." The voice was low, raspy, and hoarse. It wasn't a human voice. It was something else. Ethan's heart raced as his eyes darted through the trees. He didn't know what he had heard, but every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around and leave. Yet there was something that held him in place. Curiosity? Bravery? Foolishness? He took a deep breath, steadied his rifle, and started walking toward the clearing, every step feeling heavier than the last. The woods had become unnervingly silent, the snow thick beneath his feet, the air suffocatingly still. He had never experienced anything like this before, this palpable tension, this growing unease. As he reached the edge of the clearing, something caught his eye. At the far side, near a large oak tree, there was a figure standing. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, barely discernible against the darkening sky. For a moment, Ethan froze, his mind racing. Who could be out here? There was no one else in the woods tonight. He had made sure of that when he left the cabin. The figure didn't move. It stood there, unmoving, like a statue. Ethan's breath hitched as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The air felt wrong, thick with an unnatural chill. Then, without warning, the figure turned its head slowly to face him. Ethan's blood ran cold. The face was not a face at all. It was a hollow mask of pale skin stretched tight over bone, its eyes two dark voids that seemed to suck in the surrounding light. The creature, if that was what it was, had no expression. It was simply watching him. Without thinking, Ethan raised his rifle, his hands trembling as he aimed at the figure. "Who are you?" His voice cracked in the stillness, his words barely audible in the freezing air. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky, unnatural. Then, without a sound, it began to move toward him. Each step was slow, deliberate, and it sent a jolt of panic through Ethan's chest. His heart hammered in his ears as he backed away, but his feet were frozen to the ground, and the figure's gaze never wavered. "Get out!" The voice rasped again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. Panic surged through him. He couldn't breathe. His limbs felt numb. He fumbled with his rifle, his hands shaking as he tried to steady the weapon, but the figure was getting closer. Each step it took was another step closer to him. Ethan did the only thing he could think of. He ran. His legs moved on instinct, faster than they ever had before. He burst through the clearing, not caring which direction he was headed, just knowing that he had to escape. The crunch of snow beneath his boots was deafening as he ran, the figure's footsteps following closely behind. He didn't dare look back. Every instinct told him that whatever was behind him was not something he wanted to see again. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning with the cold air. The trees around him blurred as he pushed forward, praying that he would make it back to the cabin, to safety. But the farther he ran, the deeper into the woods he seemed to go. The familiar paths and landmarks were gone, replaced by the dense thicket of trees and snow. The world was growing darker, and the woods felt endless. He didn't know how much time had passed when he finally stumbled onto the edge of the forest, his legs aching and his vision swimming. The cabin was just ahead, a pale light glowing from the windows. With one final burst of strength, Ethan stumbled toward it, pushing open the door and collapsing inside, slamming it shut behind him. He sat there in the dim light of the cabin, gasping for air, his heart still racing. The woods outside were silent again, but Ethan knew better. Whatever had been in the forest was still out there, waiting, and he wasn't sure if it was ever truly gone. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The wind howled through the trees, a bitter, relentless scream that made the air feel like knives. It was the middle of winter, the kind of cold that gnawed at your bones, and the group of hunters, 4 men in their 30s, had come to this remote cabin in the mountains hoping for peace and a successful hunting trip. It was supposed to be just like any other trip, long days in the snow chasing deer, followed by nights of drinking, talking, and relaxing. But from the moment they arrived, something had felt off. Ben had sensed it first. He was the quiet one in the group, the one who spent more time observing than talking. The others, Jake, Mark, and Mike, had noticed him staring at the woods outside the cabin when they arrived, but they just laughed it off. "Come on, Ben, you're imagining things. It's just a little snowstorm," Mike had said, clapping him on the back. "This place is remote, but it's peaceful." Ben hadn't said anything more, but the feeling grew stronger as the day wore on. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by towering trees that looked like they had been there for centuries. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive, and every so often when the wind calmed, there were noises, footsteps, soft and almost imperceptible, crunching through the snow just outside the cabin walls. By the time night fell, the storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard. Snow piled up against the windows, and the wind rattled the wood as if the cabin was being shaken by some unseen force. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The men ate a hearty meal and opened a few beers, trying to push away the unease that had settled in their chests. They sat around the table, but Ben's mind wasn't on the conversation. Every time he glanced out the window, he saw nothing but darkness. But in that darkness, there was something. Waiting. Mike, always the one to lighten the mood, began telling ghost stories. Spooky tales from his childhood, urban legends, and haunted places. Everyone laughed, but Ben's unease only deepened. The others didn't notice the way he stiffened every time the wind howled louder, or the way his eyes kept darting to the window as if expecting something to appear. Finally, Jake broke the silence, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "You're not scared, are you, Ben?" Ben hesitated. He didn't want to seem like a coward, but something about this place didn't sit right. He shrugged, forcing a smile. "No, just tired, I guess." The night wore on, the wind still howling outside. Ben decided to go to bed early, needing to get some rest before the hunting started again tomorrow. The others were still laughing, joking about their plans for the next day, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he climbed into the loft above the main room, the wind seemed to intensify. The noise outside was almost deafening now, like a giant creature was scraping its claws across the cabin's walls. Ben lay in the bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every so often, he could hear something moving outside, something large, heavy, like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate. At some point, he must have drifted off to sleep, because when he opened his eyes again, it was pitch black. The storm had died down, but the silence was overwhelming. Ben sat up in bed, his senses alert. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't understand why. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet hitting the cold wooden floor. He glanced down at the door leading to the stairs. It was slightly ajar. Ben frowned. He was sure he had closed it before bed. Slowly, he stood and walked over to it, pushing it open. The hallway was dark, save for the dim light from the dying embers in the fireplace downstairs. The air was freezing cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the loft. He crept downstairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. Something wasn't right, and he had to find out what it was. The floor creaked under his feet, but he ignored it, his eyes fixed on the living room ahead. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The chairs around the table, light once empty, now had figures sitting in them, shadows indistinct and shifting as though they were there but not fully. They didn't have faces, they were just shapes. Ben froze, his breath caught in his throat. He stared at the figures, wondering if he was dreaming, but then he noticed something else. The air in the cabin had changed, thick and cold, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. And then, just as quickly as the figures had appeared, they were gone. The chairs were empty again, and the room was as still as it had been before. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, there was nothing. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence, a loud, echoing crash from upstairs. Ben spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed the rifle from the corner, the weapon suddenly feeling too light in his hands. Was it the others? What had happened? Ben rushed upstairs, almost tripping in his haste. When he reached the top, he found Jake, Mark, and Mike standing in the hallway, staring at the walls. They didn't look at him when he called their names. "What's going on?" Ben asked, his voice shaky. Jake turned slowly, his eyes wide, unblinking. "Did you hear it too?" he whispered. Ben nodded, stepping forward, his gaze following Jake's. On the wall, faint scratches marred the wood, long, deep gouges as if something had dragged its claws along the surface. "What is that?" Mike's voice trembled as he looked at the marks, his face pale. "I don't know," Ben answered. His voice was barely a whisper. "But I've been hearing things. All night." Mark's eyes flicked to the window. The wind had picked up again, and the snow outside was swirling in a frenzy. He turned to the others. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before they could move, the air in the room grew cold, so cold that they could see their breath in front of them. The scratching noise returned, this time louder, sharper, as if whatever was outside the cabin had moved closer. Suddenly, the door to the loft flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. Ben jumped back, instinctively raising his rifle, but there was nothing there. The wind had stopped, and the silence was suffocating. And then they heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow just outside the cabin, moving around the building, circling them. Ben's eyes widened as he realized the truth. The thing they had felt, the thing they had heard, it was not the wind. It was something else, something ancient. And it was hunting them. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the door burst open, a gust of icy wind flooding the room, but there was nothing there. The men stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror. Ben turned to run, but the door slammed shut again with a force that made the whole cabin shake. They were trapped, and then, from somewhere deep in the woods, they heard a voice, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It was something older, something that had been waiting for them to come. Story the end.